joining us. We have an interview with someone who's been a good friend of mine for a long time, author and lawyer Helen Dale, originally from Australia, who lives in the UK. Helen came onto the literary scene with her debut novel, The Hand That Signed the Paper, which is a novel about a family from Eastern Europe that emigrated to Australia during World War II, and tells their story and looks back at it in flashback and does a very good job looking at the moral ambiguities of what happens to people in war. She also writes for several outlets such as CapX, Law and Liberty, and she does a weekly morning spot on UK Talk Radio with Mike Graham. Helen, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Josh. I'm very pleased to be here.
When I was thinking about this conversation, one of the things that occurred to me is I think you are an example of maybe one of the earlier targets I know of cancel culture or proto cancel culture, which is obviously a household word these days, but it was going on for you when your first book, The Hand That Signed the Paper, came out. Would you say that's fair?
It's fair. I'm not the earliest example of cancel culture or proto-cancel culture. The earliest case of it was actually, according to historical research by an Australian legal academic called Russell Blackford, Professor Russell Blackford, at the University of Newcastle, but not the British one, University of Newcastle in Australia. He took an interest in this because of my story, but he went and did a lot of research and established that the first example of this type of cancel culture in a very specific way that was designed to ruin, or an attempt to ruin, someone's career was actually directed at a German politician who was the president of the Bundestag in 1986. And he was cancelled over a speech that he gave in the Bundestag that was considered to be too sympathetic to Hitler or to the Nazis. But what he was trying to do, and he was very upset when this didn't work out for him, was he was trying to get across to younger Germans who have lost to a large degree cultural memory of what Nazi Germany was like. He was trying to get across to them what it was like and how Hitler sucked so many otherwise perfectly normal, regular people into following the Nazi Party. But that meant he went in his speech and quoted a whole lot of pretty famous Nazis, and he deliberately went through and picked out some of their strongest arguments. And of course, that meant that he got cancelled. Unfortunately, his name has slipped my mind, but his case history is recorded in a great deal of detail in Professor Blackford's book, The Tyranny of Opinion, it's called. The next example of this kind of cancel culture is the one that everyone has heard of. And that happened in 1989, and it was, of course, Salman Rushdie.
Yep.
The idea of shutting authors down and cancelling authors had not been done by private actors in the past for probably 100 years. It was always states. So the Australian government, for example, became notorious for banning Lady Chatterley's Lover and Ulysses because of the sex scenes in them. There was, of course, the famous Lady Chatterley trial in the UK, and there were similar instances in the United States with attempts to prevent early feminists from posting information out to people in the mail about contraception. So it had been, for quite a long time, it had been states doing this, not private actors. With Salman Rushdie and with the campaign against the German politician whose first name was Philip, I can't remember the surname, it was the private sector, it was individuals outside of the state making it, purporting effectively to act like a state. Although by the same token, I have to acknowledge that I don't approve of states doing that either. But it was a significant shift in the late 80s and early to mid 90s when private citizens came to believe that this was an appropriate way to behave. If you don't like a writer or if you don't like a politician, you try to destroy them in some way so that they can no longer have a career or can no longer be published.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you bring up Salman Rushdie. I sort of got the sense, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I got the sense from a lot of people who were alarmed by what happened to him that maybe they thought it was a one-off,
Yes.
and that this would be enough to shake people up enough to say, oh, wait a minute, something really sinister happened there. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. But of course, that isn't what happened culturally. It's only gotten much, much worse.
Yes,
since Salman Rushdie's cancelling.
Yes. And here I will, if you don't mind, I'll take a couple of minutes to explain a bit of my history.
Please do.
This is the, you will notice Disaffected earlier put up the image of the cover of the book that was the edition in 1995 that won the Miles Franklin Award. The Miles Franklin Award, that you can see there's a difference between the covers. This is the 20th anniversary edition that was published in 2015, and it has an essay in the beginning that explains this history, no doubt a lot better than I will now, because I'm trying to verbalize it and put it all into order, and it never works as well spoken as it does written. Now, the Miles Franklin Award is the Australian equivalent of the Booker Prize in the United Kingdom or the Pulitzer Prize in the United States. It's the country's most prestigious literary award. I was the youngest ever winner of it, and as should be obvious from the writing that you can see on this cover, it was not the only award it won several of them. Now, there was, as a result of largely of me winning that award, although there was a little tiny bit of it beforehand, the hand that signed the paper became enormously controversial. There were a number of different aspects to this controversy. In explaining the background, I'm only going to cover one of them. So if you look this up on the internet, or if you read the essay in the beginning, which is a couple of thousand words long, there will be more detail that I don't cover here. But in terms of the thesis of Disaffected and Josh's show about the behavior of certain people in activist left movements, this one aspect is most relevant to that, and the others are kind of a sideline. Broadly speaking, one of the attacks on me was I was accused of anti-Semitism. And the bulk of the basis for this accusation, it had two aspects. One, I had portrayed my Nazi characters or Nazi allied characters. They weren't actually the Nazis. They were people who collaborated with the Nazis from Eastern Europe as sort of normal human beings who seemed to be, in some ways, not so much sympathetic, but people who you could relate to and think, I know people like that who could be sucked into something in that way. So they seemed fairly normal. I didn't make them two-headed alien babies as Nazi characters are often portrayed in sort of war films and Where Eagles Dare and things like that. And the other aspect of it was the beginning of something that is now very widespread, of the attribution of the views of an author's characters to the author. So, for example, a couple of my characters are concentration camp guards, and they say concentration camp guardy things. They're fascists and racists and sexists and all of the things that go with those kind of extreme right-wing politics. Now, those views were attributed to me. I had, masses of newspaper articles written about me where a character in a novel, the winner of the Miles Franklin Award has to be a work of fiction, were attributed to me. And no matter how often I said the very standard literary line that writers have done since time immemorial, these are characters in a novel. They may be based on historical figures, but nobody could go back and talk to dead people. So therefore you have to make them up. You have to rely on historical records at the time and see what people said and how they thought about things. So a bit like the German politician, I was relying on historical sources. And where I did get to interview people, I was having to interview people who were very old. And older people's memories start to fade. So you have to make a lot of it up. Now, what happened as a result of that was an extraordinary, decades-long attempt to ruin my career. And it was really quite incredible in the sense that every time I got a new job, people would find out where I worked and send abusive correspondence to my employer. If I moved house, people would find out where I lived and send abusive correspondence to me. When the Australian government introduced the secret electors or silent electors role, which is so that you can be you still vote because voting is compulsory in Australia, but it's very hard for people to find you using the electoral roll. One of the things that happened to me is I had stalkers coming to wherever I was living, and one of the ways they were finding me was through the electoral roll. And I wasn't the only celebrity that this was happening to at the time. It was happening to a number of people, and so the federal government introduced the concept of the silent elector. So what happened then, when I went onto the silent electors roll and could not be easily found, is I had, at the time, one of them has since died, I had 3 siblings and both my parents were still alive. And so people would go to where they were living. And the thing is, my parents at the time were farmers, and anybody who knows even the most basic thing about Australia knows it's the same size as the United States without Alaska. And the property where they were at the time was a remote part of Queensland, and people were still going to their house and walking up a driveway that was like miles long. So this is how serious this had got by this point.
How long did this go on, the most active part of this campaign against you?
The most active part probably lasted for about 6 months, 6 to 12 months. And there was a period, I would say, for about 12 to 18 months where Australia Post were delivering my mail in sacks. You know, those great big gunny sacks.
Yeah.
Because I won the Miles Franklin Award in 1995. This is a long time ago. This is before the internet. Well, it wasn't totally before the internet, but email, the people who used email were in a minority. And I need to be quite frank and say that in terms of the abuse that I was sent, very little of it came electronically until much, much later. And overwhelmingly, when it did come electronically, it was not sent to me, it was sent to my employers. The rest...
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Helen. The delay makes us step on each other a little bit. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
The overall campaign against me, though, lasted a lot longer than that. To give you an idea, I'm one of these people, I don't think I have a right to be a writer, so I qualified as a lawyer. In Australia, it's a divided profession, so you're either a solicitor or a barrister. I initially went to the bar, and then I came to the UK and changed to the other branch of the profession and became a solicitor. In America, I think you would call a barrister a trial attorney, and a solicitor would just be an attorney. So I was happy to do that job, and that was totally fine. And the thing is, though, when you move between countries, because the law is different in different countries, you have to keep getting readmitted and admitted to practice so that you can actually give people advice and be insured and all of those things that go with it. And the legal system in Scotland, where I wanted to work at one point, is quite different from the legal system in England and Wales. Basically, a lot of people don't realise this, but in order to be able to practice in Scotland and take up a job offer in Scotland, I had to study at night and study different subjects. I had to do a year-long Roman law course. Scottish family law and property law is very different, so on and so forth. I went to the University of Edinburgh and did those subjects that I had to do in order to be able to practice in Scotland. And then, of course, I went through the process of getting all the paperwork set up for admission to the Law Society so that I could practice in Scotland and not just do what they call English work. You can only do English work. It means that if I had to do Scottish specialist work, I would have to be supervised by a Scottish solicitor, and that's a big drain on their time when they have other things to do. And this was, when I was going through this process, was in 2012. I won the Miles Franklin Award, and the big controversy was in 1995. The Law Society of Scotland was deluged with objections to my admission. I had to hire legal advisors.
All those years later.
Yeah. I had to hire legal advisors, including a woman who's now a close personal friend of mine who acted for me in order to deal with this, or otherwise I was literally not going to be able to start work. Yes, I obviously came through it and I came out the other side, but it was all of those years later. Then again, when I moved back to Australia and worked for a parliamentarian, an Australian senator. The issue here was no longer admission. So people wrote to the parliamentarian. Extraordinarily abusive correspondence to a sitting senator. And this is one aspect of the Australian political system that is quite similar to the system in the United States. You know how in your system, senators are kind of a little bit more exalted than people in the House of Representatives.
Yep.
This phenomenon also exists in Australia. So you had people who thought it was totally fine, and I don't want to get you thrown off of YouTube, Josh, to write to a sitting senator and call him a fucking cunt for hiring me.
Mm-hmm.
People thought, and worse. I mean, it was extraordinary. Now go on.
I want to say as a reader, I mean, we've talked about this privately. When I was talking with you recently about The Hand That Signed the Paper, I told you that the first thought that came to my mind about it was that it was haunting. There are a lot of characters in this book, but it is set up to look at a Ukrainian family who emigrated to Australia. And in the book, you go back into the family history. There are scenes of this family before they emigrated in the Ukraine, before World War II, during World War II. And what made it so haunting is that the characters in your book are in fact ordinary people, whether they're Jews, whether they're Ukrainians, whether they're Bolshevists, villagers, city dwellers. The moral ambiguity, and what I mean by that is the degree to which people that all of us can recognize as our own uncle, grandmother, grandfather, the shopkeeper, the degree to which these circumstances put people in horrendous ethical and moral quandaries and the things they did in order to survive and get past them just really gripped me. And
that's what I wanted to achieve. You have literally, without me telling you, just by reading the book, you have summarized exactly what I set out to achieve as a novelist. So, and the traditional thing is when a writer succeeds with one reader like that, maybe they can succeed with others. This book, partly as a result of the controversy, partly as a result of winning mainly the Miles Franklin, but also other awards, became a very big bestseller. And that also discloses one of the differences between cancel culture in 1995 and what happens now. When you read about people like Kosako Jackson or Amelie Wenjiao or other people who have been cancelled, what happens now is their books are cancelled before publication, so they never make a penny. This was a large difference. If people went after authors then, and even with the very famous example of Salman Rushdie, it was after the book was published. It was not something that you could do to an author before. That is new. So that's an important sort of little thing to add. So this was going on.
It's. I know you know this, and I know probably everybody listening and watching knows this, but the situation is itself so morally perverse because, we have to, I think that people of goodwill, people who care about how well or how poorly a society is doing, how well or how poorly the individuals in a society are doing, whether or not we are on a path to a beneficial goal or not, understanding the moral ambiguity that can obtain under situations of extreme duress is vitally important to that. And, I sort of know it, but I still can't quite understand how we got to a place where what you did with the book, and you do it in your other writing as well. I mean, I read your pieces in CapEx and Law and Liberty. You often use the phrase, the past is a different place. They do things differently there.
It's a famous quote from J.P. Hartley's The Go-Between. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. I paraphrase it in The Hand That Signed the Paper, and it is probably my lodestar as a writer. I'm one of these people who thinks you actually have to engage critically with the past. And the modern presenteeism, I suppose you would have to call it, the whole phenomenon of presenteeism, whereby we judge everybody in the past, good and bad, and in between, and most people realistically are probably in between, by the standards of the present is just complete nonsense. And the person who actually puts this best is actually, admittedly, a long way up the tree, one of my employers. And he's the editor of The Spectator in the UK. His name is Fraser Nelson. And he says this a lot. He says, just as there are things that people did in the past that we look at now with utter horror, there are things that we are doing now and we don't know what they are. That's the important thing. We don't know what they are. We can guess, but we could be wrong, that people in the future will look back on us and what we did in utter horror. And that's the kind of updated version of the Hartley quotation. You know, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there.
Well, it's well put. And I think there may be one slight difference to tease out there. We may hold mores right now. We may hold political views that we don't realize are going to be looked back on in horror in the future. But taking your book, taking the hand that signed the paper, and looking at some of the things that the characters in your book felt compelled to do in order to survive during World War II. These are people who, many of whom, not all of whom, but many of whom, shared some of the values that we have today. And it wasn't so much that they had an entirely different morality system, but when someone is in such extremis, they are starving, people in the village cannot feed each other, they can't even take care of their own children. The things that they felt forced to do, which are in fact horrific, and people can read the book if they want to find out what some of these things are. The power of that came from the fact that some of these people are people that we could recognize and say they probably have a moral compass fairly similar to mine. Oh my God. Would that have been me?
Yes.
Had I been in that village?
One reviewer in Australia, who is dead now, made the point, we all think that when we read a book about the Second World War or the Holocaust or the Eastern Front or Pearl Harbor or those kind of things, we all think we put ourselves on the side of the angels, on the side of the good guys. But what would save us, except sheer luck from being one of the Japanese Zero pilots bombing Pearl Harbor? What would save us from being in the NKVD in the Soviet Union? What would save us from being in the Waffen-SS in Nazi Germany? It is literally just luck. And I thought that was a very insightful comment. It was another thing that I was trying to achieve in the book. And moving sort of beyond just what I was setting out to do as a novelist, I've got quite strong views about how I think things should be written and how they should work. Strong and fairly conservative views about literature and the arts in this sense. I actually think things that should be true and should be beautiful or should be moving or should be thought-provoking. I'm not convinced by the sort of modern desire to turn everything into a memoir or to grossly simplify morally complex situations. I don't think that helps anyone. So yes, I am your sort of classic T.S. Eliot style conservative littérateur, basically, to get the gender wrong in French. But what I found is that view of literature and writing and the arts that I had certainly been taught at high school. I went to a very, very traditional conservative Christian high school, but conservative Christian doesn't mean the same in the UK and Australia that it does in the United States. The traditional conservative public schools, which are actually private schools that you have to pay big fees to go to, your parents do, in Australia and the UK, have traditionally prided themselves, and to a large degree still do, of inculcating and providing an extremely rigorous education. So I had a very rigorous education. Many of the things that I know now, like people who read my commentary in various outlets that all over the world that I write for, one of the observations is, my goodness, you know a lot about both Christian and Muslim theology. every single bit of that I learnt in high school, not at university. I learnt it in high school. So I had a very traditional and a very advantaged, I'll be the first to admit it, my parents paid for it, education in that way. But what I found, both when I went to university and then when I participated in the wider literary culture, that approach to both education and to literature and the arts was passing out of society. And it is now largely gone. It tends to mainly be the redoubt of conservative publications in the United Kingdom and Australia, like the most famous example being The Spectator, of course, but there are many others, but it's the popular and very famous one. And I think that is a great loss, because we are now engaged in a gross oversimplification of the moral frameworks and moral beliefs that people in the past had, but also that people in the present have. We're not just traducing the past, we're traducing ourselves. And that is a very great shame, because one of the things that literature can do, and Steven Pinker makes this argument in Better Angels of Our Nature, is provide us with one way, it's not the only way, but one way to understand people who are unlike ourselves. That is, part of the work of literature. And it allows us to understand that there are other people in the world and they have minds separate from our own. And we should not get into the business of thinking that what we think should be automatically in their mind. Other people are themselves and in and of themselves and are unique in that important sense.
It is, yes, that is important. I think maybe also other people have their own minds, they think in their own way. But I think another thing literature can do, philosophical discussion can do this, honest conversation can do this, is to show people that, while we are all individuals, we are humans. Yes. There is such a thing as human nature. I think that one of the major problems that plagues us politically and culturally today, most acutely on the left, is, and it may not be spoken explicitly, but the idea is that there is no such thing as human nature, that we are a de novo creation, that we make ourselves,
tabula
that we
rasa.
Can decide.
The tabula rasa,
yes,
the blank slate.
The blank slate.
And we are not
Absolutely.
Blank slates, no. And this is, this gets on to the next point that emerged out of this. The bulk of the people having a go at me over the hand that signed the paper, and there's no way to dress this up because you'll find it in 5 minutes on the internet, were Jews. Or, to be quite frank, the organised Jewish lobby, or Jewish community leaders, or however you want to refer to them. I personally think you need to use the word lobby, and I think you need to use the word lobby with any activist organisation that attempts to engage in cancel culture. And that can be big tobacco, as it did in the 60s. It can be big agriculture. It can be big renewables. Look at the mess that Solindra landed Barack Obama in and cost the US taxpayer $500 million in subsidies, literally up the spout. So I think you need to say lobbyists.
Yeah, well, and that we're coming up to a point where we're going to take a break, and I want to pick up on a lot of these and shift the conversation into these topics when we come back. But I will say that I think your point about needing to say that this is a lobby, that these are the activists, is very well taken, because the people who purport to speak on behalf of what we call a community, it's another word I try to avoid these days, are often taken by those of us who are passively consuming news or consuming commentary. Well, they say that, this is what Jewish people think, so it must be. This is what transgender people think.
This is what lesbians think, yes.
Right.
You and I have both experienced this.
Oh, yes. And these people are self-appointed spokespeople. They're not elected spokespeople. They're not appointed by the constituency that they think they have and that they claim to represent.
And
but for whatever reason, go ahead.
The point that I want to make before we go to your ad break is I had people seriously try to tell me, after fairly obviously, I've described it to your listeners, fairly obviously a lot of Jewish community leaders had behaved in a pretty bad, pretty atrocious way, and often in a named way. You can, if you go back through microfiche and through the history of the Australian press, you'll find articles written by them. It's not hard to find. I had people seriously try to claim to me that Jews were uniquely bad. Now, for doing this, I kept my own counsel. I didn't say anything, but I thought in my head, and I have since, and we can discuss this after the break, went and did a lot of research and investigation of my own. I remember thinking, that's not possible. Human beings went through an evolutionary bottleneck. We know this. We are more alike than not alike biologically.
Yes.
There are more differences between the sexes, far more differences than there are between the races. The idea that only one ethnic lobby group is engaging in this kind of really reprehensible behaviour, the expression I always used when I discussed this with my dad was, this strikes me as fanciful and impossible. It might have been what I saw, but that was a peculiar feature of my particular controversy based on the novel that I had written. I doubted in the extreme, although at that point, this is back in the 90s, I had no proof that there were other organisations. I doubted in the extreme that it was just this group. I strongly suspected that there were other people doing the same thing. It just wasn't visible to me. And it became visible to me from others later. And I couldn't explain the behaviour that I was seeing. I genuinely couldn't explain it. And it was only when I first encountered you years ago, now, long before Disaffected, long before Josh Slocum going into the press and starting to write articles about this and so on and so forth and saying that there might have been a psychiatric element to it, I thought you were commenting, I think a lot of these people, this is when you were first, might have even been 10 years ago now, you were saying, I think a lot of these people are mentally ill. I think a lot of these people have very particular sets of behaviours that have roots in mental illness. And at first I poo-pooed it. I'll be the first person to admit that. I didn't say anything to you because I liked you and I found your ideas valuable in other areas, and I found you very funny as well. But I then, when I do things like this, I keep my own counsel and then I go away and read and research. So I listened to what you were saying. I also read books like The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, where they describe the same phenomenon in a great deal of detail in the context of cancel culture in American universities. And it occurred to me that there is something wrong with activism. There is something wrong with lobbying, and the explanation may not be a political one. And that's...
And with that, that's a great setup. We're going to actually go to a break now, but we're going to come back and dive right into exactly what is wrong with activism, what's its name, and how should we think about it. So join us after the break. For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell. Welcome back. We're going to get into the rest of this conversation with author and my friend Helen Dale. But first, I want to say thank you to the people who are making this possible in the UK. You are watching and listening to Helen coming to you from the studios of the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, which I highly recommend. It's Carl Benjamin and his team. I'm sorry I won't remember all of your names because I was just introduced to you electronically, but I know there's Vicky and John. I know there's a Callum and there are some other people, but they have graciously made their studio available so that we can get this high quality connection. So I want to say thank you, and I definitely want to say to people, this is one of the podcasts that I listen to, and I think that you should listen to it as well. So you set this up, Helen. You gave a great setup to this. We've talked about this We've talked about these issues privately for years, and it's interesting to me. You're one of the friends that has known me since I was on the liberal left and I was a woke social justice warrior.
You absolutely were. I can completely confirm that this is exactly what Josh was like, because I knew him. We got to watch the car crash of the new atheist movement together. That's how far we go back.
Yes. Car crash. The car
Train
crash
wreck.
to end all car crashes. So in talking about it's interesting because, of course, as almost everyone who moves away from that, I know I mentioned this a lot on the show, but it's kind of a running thing. My therapist said something to me a couple of years ago that I bristled at a little bit, but it was only a reflexive bristle. He said, well, that was the time that you got yourself out of the SJW cult. And he wasn't saying it jokingly. He was just saying quite matter-of-factly that you were in a cult. And of course, he was right. He was right about that. Many people are in a cult and they don't know that they're in a cult. And it doesn't. And one of the ways that they don't know that is we have an idea when we talk about cults. People say, well, how can my political party be a cult? How can my circle of friends and associates be a cult? We don't have one single charismatic leader. But I think we need to update our definition of cult or cult-like groups to take account of the fact that, especially in the internet and the social media age, it is no longer required for people to coalesce around a system of values that encourages this kind of abusive behavior. We don't need a David Koresh, right? We don't need one single leader. It is a decentralized system of leadership. It might pass among people, but there seems to be something about social media seems to become more than the sum of its parts, and it creates an atmosphere that allows for the propagation of cult-like thinking and cult-like behavior, regardless of whether there's one person. I mean, we've seen temporary leaders. We saw this in the new atheist movement, people who were in fashion one day who are absolute horrible, vile bigots the next, right?
David
It rotates.
Silverman
You can
is
be
the one
dethroned.
David Silverman is the one I remember. So he was like the Ant's Pants, and his Twitter handle is Mr. Atheist Pants, which I think is quite funny. And that was actually given to him by Stephen Colbert. So that gives you an idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he got the nickname Mr. Atheist Pants from Stephen Colbert, and you can find it on YouTube if you go wandering about looking for it. And then suddenly David Silverman was the bad guy. And it was overnight.
Why? What did he? What was his sin?
I never even really got to the bottom of what was going on there. But I think I will add a little bit to your point about David Koresh, because the aspect of cult-like behavior, whilst it may not be as focused on a single charismatic leader like the Koresh or an L. Ron Hubbard figure or something like that, the aspect that is almost identical, so much so that I cannot see any difference between it, and it's certainly what I experienced and what a large number of other people have experienced, is the concept that exists in Scientology of making opponents fair game. And those of you who have any sort of involvement with New Atheism would know that this is one of the things that the New Atheists got right. There was this tendency of new religious movements to glom onto dissenters, people who had often previously been in the movement, and just make them a target, paint a target on them and make their lives impossibly difficult. And the expression that was used was within the organization, particularly Scientology, was fair game. We will make this person fair game. Now, this happened to me, and there were times, I don't know how successful it was, in the sense that there were certainly periods where I could not get anything published, and it got back to me through the Bush Telegraph, as we call it in Australia, because the literary community is quite small, that, a certain individual has called up every news editor in the land and said not to publish you. And eventually her influence started to run out of legs, and I started to become published again. And one of the outlets that I got published quite early on, apart from the Australian, which actually sponsored one of the awards that I won. So I, for the most part, had a fairly good relationship with the Australian because it sponsored a literary award that I won. But one of the organisations that came on board was a British organisation. It was The Spectator. And it was just The Spectator's view that they will not be bullied. And anybody who has had anything to do with Andrew Neil in the UK will see that attempts by wokies to bully Andrew Neil and to say, oh, we're going to pull advertising from you or so on and so forth. And Andrew Neil's response is literally, that's not how it works, sweetie. You will never be advertising in The Spectator ever again.
Yeah,
you behave like that.
He really stood up to that. I was applauding from my seat. Okay, not only are you not going to tell us what to do, but we won't take your custom.
Yeah.
End of story. That's it.
And so
I wish
that's
we had
a very
more of that
Spectator
backbone.
thing. And I was very grateful for The Spectator they approached me, and at that point I was actually working for the Senator. We would love you to write for us. They were really good, and I got clearance from the Senator, because there is always a degree of awkwardness when a parliamentarian, who is supposed to be the person who is known in the public eye, hires an extremely prominent person. And my boss, Senator Lionhelm, was criticised at the time. Oh, you're trying to do a Paul Keating. Now, Paul Keating was actually a prime minister in Australia a few decades ago, and he hired a well-known writer called Don Watson, a similar sort of background, very successful writer who'd won awards and so on and so forth. And the relationship finished up souring because the writer had his own separate story, and there is a problem when a staffer becomes the story. And so I got permission from my senator to write for The Spectator, and I had to always be careful about this, because you didn't want a situation where the staffer becomes more famous than the politician, because it's not the staffer who's running for elections, it's the politician who's running for elections. I am not elected, basically. It's a very simple truth. But the experience of being a political staffer, and I need to explain a little bit about the way the Aussie system works. It's quite similar to the US in that there are two houses. There's a House of Representatives and there's a Senate. My boss was a senator. The Senate, however, is elected using a different system from the House of Representatives. So it is more politically diverse. It's much easier to get elected from a minor party, a smaller political party, the equivalent of, say, the Greens or the Libertarians in the US. Now, my boss was from one of these smaller political parties, people for whom it's very difficult to get elected in the lower house, which is constituency-based system like in the UK, although once again, the voting system is a bit different. Now, what that meant is that the Senate is composed differently from the House of Representatives, and it can be very, very difficult for the House of Representatives to get bills passed unless it can win the favour of not only its own political party, but a sufficiently large number of what is called the crossbench, which are these senators from smaller political parties, in order to get legislation through. And often one of the things that the smaller political parties can do, and that's how I got hired, is they tend to hire very good lawyers as advisors to these senators, because what we would try to do is get amendments to government bills that were simpatico with the political views of my boss, basically, who was what you would describe in America as a classical liberal. He calls himself a libertarian, but he's not really an American-style libertarian. He's too British and too Australian in that sense. So if you want something analogous, you would need to think in terms of a classical liberal. So think of someone whose politics are quite close to those of, say, Margaret Thatcher, and you would have a fairly good idea. So the heuristic is socially liberal and economically conservative. Now, what that meant is that because my boss's vote counted a lot, there were times when his one vote decided whether a piece of legislation, government legislation, lived or died. What that meant is that we were a pinch point in the Parliament in Canberra for lobbyists. And this is where I discovered that everything that I had experienced with the Jewish lobby or Jewish community organisations existed everywhere. Every single lobbying outfit is the same. It is full of the same kind of people who all think that the way to win political arguments, and these are political arguments, this is about legislation, these people are lawmakers, the way to win political arguments is to treat them as fair game, or their staff as fair game, if they don't do what you want. And it's not just abusive correspondence to parliamentarians. It's not just being waylaid by mobs of protesters while you're trying to go into the entrance in Parliament into the Senate. It's not just stuff like that, which is sort of the obvious things where you get buttonholed by a news reporter and so on and so forth. Yes, those things happen and they can be very irritating. You can be followed around by the press, and you can have people trying to record you when you're making something, making a casual remark and use it against you later on. It's not just that. There was an organisation, they appear to have died a death, but they were a left-wing lobbying organisation that existed in Australia when I was working for Senator Lionhelm, called Get Up. And Get Up's shtick, in addition to all the usual say rude things about this staffer in the newspaper, try to make them unemployable, write abusive letters to their boss, so on and so forth. They had a large number of members. And their shtick during sitting weeks, because remember, Canberra is it's a created capital. It's like Brasilia, or to a degree like Washington, DC. Everybody has to go there in order to govern the country, basically. Their shtick was literally to lock down the crossbench. And they would do this by constantly ringing the phones. So every single phone line coming into Senator Lionhelm's office would be occupied. And I had people say to me, but Helen, why don't you just turn the phones off and stop them ringing you? No, you can't do that, because sometimes other politicians need to talk to you. In one case, for example, the other politician who needed to talk to me specifically, because it was a legal issue on which I had expertise, and he was trying to get David's vote, was Malcolm Turnbull, the former Prime Minister of Australia. At the time, he was the Prime Minister of Australia. So no, you cannot turn the phones off, because one of the people on the other end of the phone line might be the Prime Minister. It's like a Congress critter in the United States saying, I'll switch the phones off so nobody can get through, and the person who wants to talk to that Congress critter is Joe Biden.
Well, yes, and another way that people talk about this is this sort of glib dismissal when somebody says, I'm the target of a smearing campaign. People are trying to, smear my social reputation. Well, just get off Twitter, or just get off Facebook, or just get off LinkedIn. It's not a realistic answer. And let's get right to who these people are. You said a moment ago, it doesn't matter what lobbying group it is. It doesn't matter what issue it is. They are all the same. I agree. In many ways, they are all the same. How are they the same? What is it? What's going on with these people? And, I'm priming a little bit here because I think you and I agree on this.
This is where, when you first started talking about this, I started to think about it very seriously and read books like The Coddling of the American Mind and books like Jean Tweng's book on iGen and that kind of thing. Was where it struck me, where I was literally walking the corridors of power on behalf of my boss, by and large, admittedly, that it wasn't politics that was attracting the psychopaths. Yes, there were psychopaths in politics, and all those studies that show that the odd politician here and there is a psychopath, and that there are proportionally more of them in Congress, say, or in C-suites around the world than there are, say, in the general population. I suspect that's true. But the psychopaths in Canberra among the politicians and the staffers were grossly outnumbered by the psychopaths in the lobbying organisations. And it is that simple. And I did not know how to label this behaviour when I first started seeing it, even before I worked for the Senator, when I was having involvement in doing work for various think tanks in both the UK and Australia, where you would get a think tank, and think tanks tend to be centre-right, and overwhelmingly they would just be people who, because the universities, particularly in the social sciences, are largely closed to the right, the think tanks were a parallel intellectual universe, often full of people who were very scholarly and academic. A person I'm always quoting and using in my research is Professor Steve Davies. Now, he works for the Institute for Economic Affairs now, famously Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, but he was at Manchester University. He's a professor of economic history. He's a very smart man, and he left the university system because it was just driving him up the wall, because it's impossible to be a conservative or a classical liberal in the social sciences. So what we in think tank world, which are the sort of the world where the conservative intellectuals tend to hang out in the UK and Australia, were seeing was lobbying organisations who were not only self-appointed, which is what you were describing earlier to me, and behaving in extraordinarily bad ways. And that's why I was very alarmed when I had people say to me, oh, well, you know, the Jews are the worst for this. And I was just mortified, because I was just going, no, that can't be right. But there is clearly something going on. And this is why I get very angry with films like the Al Jazeera film, which is literally called The Lobby. And there are two of them. There's one about the Jewish lobby in the UK, and there's one about the Jewish lobby in the US. And whilst they don't directly tell lies, I mean, the one in the UK forced the resignation of the Israeli ambassador. They set it up with this premise that it's all one crowd doing it. It's just one ethnic group.
It's not.
I got to see, as a result of engaging in the world of think tanks and political advising, lobby groups across the spectrum, across the races, and across the industries producing this kind of behaviour, trying to get people sacked, locking down parliamentarians' offices so they couldn't get anything done. And so and typically the effect of that is so that legislation is not subject to appropriate scrutiny. I mean, the reason parliamentarians who are not lawyers, and my boss was not a lawyer, he was a veterinarian before he was elected, smart man, not a lawyer, not trained to read legislation, different skill. You know, so basically what this means, this behaviour where the lobbyists of various organisations just focus all their concentration on parliamentarians, and particularly crossbenchers whose vote may be up for grabs, was to prevent Parliament doing its business, and particularly the crossbench from doing its business, which was to scrutinise legislation. Now, we have all seen recently in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure you have had it in the US as well, legislation to do with the management of the coronavirus pandemic that is so badly drafted, it is impossible for ordinary members of the public, and even for attorneys and solicitors sometimes, to work out exactly what it's telling you to do. Now, when that happens with legislation, it means that it has not been adequately scrutinised. The legislature is not doing its job. Now, it's
not even internally consistent.
No. I mean, we had a barrister write a piece for CapEx, and I happen to know him socially. I know which set he's at. And he just went through areas where people were being instructed to do things where you literally could not do them both at the same time. It was extraordinary. You know, it's sort of like, for your next trek, in order to comply with the government's coronavirus regulations, you will need to stand on one leg, spin around 3 times, and whistle Dixie. It was getting to that point. It was just nuts.
While also not standing on that leg that you are required to stand on.
And not whistling, you have to hum Dixie instead. So,
you know, you said something. I'm sorry. I really would like to have you address this, because it was a really good insight that you brought up during one of our private conversations. You trace some of this, as you know. My thesis, the thesis of this show, is that we are living in a moment or an era in which cluster B rules are structuring our lives. And people may know these as cult rules. They may know them as rules in authoritarian regimes. I reduce it to cluster B, the borderlines, the narcissists, the psychopaths, everybody with a character and a personality that it could be described as dramatic or erratic. And I believe that for whatever initial foundational reason, we're living in this time, and that these organizations preferentially select for these people. These people rise to the top. It is not that everybody in these organizations, it's not that every animal rights follower in a certain organization or every Jewish person who might donate to this group that then lobbies. I am not saying that most of these people are personality disordered. I am saying that the leadership almost always is, and that there are many more of them there than you would expect if you were to look at a sample of the background population, and that the majority of us who are not personality disorder, do not have these psychiatric problems, are nonetheless very vulnerable to these people because they are often charismatic. They disguise themselves. They shapeshift. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. And most people are not aware. They really aren't aware in a very foundational way that there is such a thing as a distorted and disordered character, that there is a predictable rate in the population of people who are psychiatrically unlike us in this way. And you brought up recently, you said, you think some of this may have been let in. The door may have been cracked open by an otherwise laudable goal of destigmatizing mental illness.
Yes,
Can
I
you
do.
talk to your thoughts on that?
I will talk about that because after a lot of thinking, partly through reading your stuff, but partly through reading books like The Coddling of the American Mind and Russell Blackford's book, The Tyranny of Opinion. He's the Australian lawyer who's written about this issue as well. What happened in the laudable attempt to destigmatize mental illness and stop telling depressed people to just buck up and get over it and that kind of thing, or stop telling anxious people, I'll just go and take Mogadon, which of course they become addicted to and it actually makes it worse in the end, that kind of thing. What happened was, as part of saying it's okay to be not okay and all of these sort of trite things that you hear over here, and I'm sure you have American versions of them as well. As part of that, it bled out of, you need to get treatment, you need to go to the NHS, you need to put yourself on the list for mental health treatment, for counselling or for psychiatric care and so on and so forth. And it became, and it has become increasingly so, instead of just looking at a mentally ill person and helping them fix their disordered behavior by getting them treatment, or in the case of people who are suicidal, helping them get treatment in order to keep them safe, to get them in a position where they're not going to continue to undergo suicidal ideation and think that they should kill themselves and that's the right thing to do. What we have done is we've not just destigmatized the conditions, we've destigmatized the behavior that's attached to them. Yes. And the whole point of treatment for mental health is not to let the mentally ill person, or to encourage, I won't say let, to encourage the mentally ill person to continue to be paranoid, to continue to be so low they're below the floorboards, to continue to be so anxious they can't leave the house, to continue to be so paranoid that they are convinced that there are aliens with space beams reading their mind. You don't want people to do that. You don't want people to hysterically carry on in public and scream their heads off like we've seen in so many videos and so much news footage all over the world. Obviously it's worse in the United States, but it's happened in the UK as well, and it's happened in Australia, where people in front of national audiences on live television are literally losing their minds.
Yes, they're saying things like, if you disagree with me, you are literally killing me. You are literally enacting violence against me.
That there are two sexes, that means you're saying that I am not valid, I don't exist, and I think I will go and kill myself. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm a lawyer, but I know what that's psychiatrically disturbed behavior. And you don't need you don't need to have any sort of background in counseling or psychology or medical psychiatry to know this person's threatening suicide. That's very dangerous.
Absolutely. And of course, as yes, don't reward it. It's neither good for them nor for the people around them. But what that is, I'm not a psychiatrist either. But if you have any passing familiarity, that is classic borderline personality disorder behavior.
Well, this is the other thing I noticed was, and I meant to sort of move on to it when I was talking about the way one particular organisation in Australia would just lock down the crossbench senators, and you couldn't get phone calls in or out, even if it was someone who was like rather important, like the Prime Minister. You would get this situation where people would become hysterical I saw incidences where people from various lobby groups, and there were so many of them, I have to admit that they've blurred into each other. They would come and this is another thing, we shouldn't facilitate this, but the Australian Parliament, and I'm sure Congress in the US, and I know the Palace of Westminster does in the UK, would allow representatives from these organisations to have what's known as lobbyist passes. They're colour-coded. We all had lanyards. I had a lanyard for a staffer. There were lanyards for journalists. There were lanyards for lobbyist passes, and they were colour-coded. Meanwhile, the senators and the House and the reps had pins. And because there are relatively few of them, the parliamentary staff, the rest of the parliamentary staff would learn who they are. But they did encourage when they were first elected, and I remember when my boss was first elected, please wear your pin, Senator, until we know who you are. So you would have lobbyist passes, and that's probably not a good idea. Maybe that's the first thing we need to get rid of, is to stop giving lobbyists easy access to representatives, because it's distorting. Because what happens is representatives finish up who are from all walks of life, better people, worse people, good people, bad people. Politicians are like the rest of us, they're people. Some of them are a bit excessively ambitious, which is why you do get that sort of link between psychopathy and being a politician, but not generally amongst your backbenchers or crossbenchers, because they're never going to be a minister. They're never going to get into the cabinet. So there's less of that there. But it did mean that all the people we dealt with continuously were people who were deranged, shouting matches, screaming at staffers, screaming at parliamentary staff, including very low-level staff like cleaners.
Yeah.
There was one, for example, from one particular lobbying outfit who, and there was quite strict rules about this, who would not leave my senator's office, his rooms, his senator's rooms. You have special rooms in the parliament. This person would not leave. And the thing is, what was extraordinary was that there was a well-established procedure to deal with lobbyists who would not leave. We had a special number, we had a button to press on the phone, and it would alert the office of the Black Rod. And the Black Rod was a fancy parliamentary name that goes back into the mists of British parliamentary, Commonwealth parliamentary history, had a bevy of bother boys, basically, who would come and physically remove some hysterical blue-haired weirdo from our offices who was screaming at my senator. Yes.
Yeah, well, and that is an illustration there of the one final point I want to draw out about this, and I think that you agree on this. One of the other problems that has come about from the noble aim of destigmatizing mental illness is a confusion among the public, among stable, normal range people, about exactly what kind of mental illness we're dealing with. And I've often said to people, it is a mistake to conceive of these types of personality disorders to be the same phenomenon or of a similar kind with things like depression and anxiety, which in general terms are conditions that some of us suffer more or less from, but that can come on and impinge on our lives, put a veil over a normally vivacious person, or can make somebody who's normally ambitious and smart very disorganized and frazzled. This is different. Personality disorders, well, it's a phrase I've heard you use a lot. They go to character.
They go to character.
That phrase. One of the more traditional names is these are character disorders.
That phrase,
these are not merely people to feel sorry for.
That phrase, it goes to character, is actually from Scots law, and I'm going to introduce a little bit of Scots law here. The Scottish law and English law, as I explained earlier, is different. One of the things you can't do in Scottish criminal law is raise the cluster B disorders in mitigation. And the reason for that was actually said by one of the leading Scottish judges, this is probably 20 or 30 years ago now, where he made the comment where an attempt to do so was engaged in by counsel in a trial. And he said, the characteristics that this individual evinces appear to be no different from those of a common criminal. It's a direct quotation. And the ruling is, the principle in Scots law is that you can't call the characteristics of a common criminal a mental illness, or otherwise all you will do is turn the role of the criminal law, which is to both protect, to punish, and to rehabilitate, you will turn the entire process into therapy. And that is not the task of the criminal law. It can be in the very, very rare circumstances where you get a finding of either, someone is unfit to stand trial, someone is insane, there's temporary insanity, there's a principle known as automatism. But a lot of people think, he's not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, as my criminal law tutor at Oxford used to say. That does not mean you get to go home and have a cup of tea. It means do not pass go, do not collect £200, go straight to the loony bin. Hi, would you like a holiday in Broadmoor? People don't realise that. So it's not really the role, except where someone truly, truly is out to lunch, and you do occasionally get that. It is not the role of the law, and it is not the role of the criminal justice system to turn everything into therapy, to therapize things. I'm sure that's not a word, but to turn everything into therapy. It is not the role of the criminal law, and this is where I agree very strongly with the Scottish tradition here. It is not the role of the criminal law to find behaviour that is just really standard, common criminal behaviour and stick some sort of psychological label on it, because these people are dangerous. Their behaviour should not be approved of. That is why, in such large numbers, they finish up in jail. And this is extremely well known. This is not hard to find. You can no doubt, for the next episode of Disaffected, you'll be able to sit there and go through 50 academic papers about the high rates of psychopathy and sociopathy and histrionic disorder and all the various other things, these cluster B disorders. How many people in prisons have them, particularly for the serious crimes?
Astonishingly
Offenses,
high.
The violent assaults and homicide. It's astonishingly
and also
high.
Fraud, financial fraud and extortion.
Yeah.
Yes. They are dangerous. That is the point. They are dangerous, and they are not only dangerous in a physical sense. If anyone believes that, well, most psychopaths are serial killers, and if I avoid people who do things like serial killing, then I've avoided the danger. Unfortunately, that isn't the case. It's only a small number of such people who are actually violent killers. But there are many other ways that they can be dangerous, and I think we should all take a lesson from the Scots Law approach to that. Helen, we could go on for much longer. This is a fascinating conversation, and I wish we could, but we're coming up on the end here, and I want to thank you.
No, that's no problem at all.
For sharing your perspective.
But just be aware.
And your experience.
I suppose if I have a message to listeners, it's be aware of what lobbyists and lobby groups are attempting to do in your name if you are from a minority. I'm from a minority. Josh is from a minority. I had the experience of, in Australia, because I was involved in the campaign for same-sex marriage. I was involved in the legislative drafting in that process. I saw the very beginning of the gay rights movement starting to go off the rails. And so much so I got permission from my boss to write an article in The Spectator about it, pleading with people to be sane and to be reasonable. Otherwise, there was a real danger that the plebiscite could be lost. Now, in the end, that didn't happen. People did wind their necks in, and I like to think I contributed a bit to that process. But don't think it's just the lobby group you don't like. If you're opposed to US gun laws, for example, don't assume it's just the NRA. If you're anti-abortion, for example, don't assume it's just NARAL. Your lobbying organisations, with very few exceptions, are infected and often run by people with really quite serious mental problems who do not know how to engage in, and this is the kind of thing that matters to me because I'm interested in the whole idea of representativeness and parliamentary procedure. These are people who are causing the quality of your government to be crap. Here's one I'll throw out there before I finish, and Josh can finish on this note. One of the reasons why the evacuation from Afghanistan has been such a catastrophic disaster is not just because Joe Biden's hopeless or Donald Trump did a deal with the Taliban or the orders are confusing or so on and so forth. I guarantee you There will have been lobbying and behaviour, and in this case, it'll be the classic military-industrial complex running all around your Congress critters, filling their ears full of nonsense. Which is why you had Joe Biden getting up a few months ago saying, oh, the Afghan army is fine. There's 300,000 of them and they're armed to the teeth. Yes, and the Taliban rolled the entire country up like a window shade in a week. So this is serious. Yes. This is very serious. Think about your representatives, but also think about the people who you are allowing to represent you if you are from a minority, one of the so-called intersectional minorities, and Josh and I are the sexual minorities, but if you are Black, if you are Jewish, if you are Asian American, I mean, I realize most of Josh's listeners are in the US, be very, very careful about the people you allow to speak on your behalf, because a significant number of them will be out to lunch. Whether they are out to lunch in exactly the same way as Josh describes, I don't know. But the behaviour is extremely bad. And I got to see it up close and personal while I was working for a parliamentarian in what is otherwise considered to be a well-governed, orderly liberal democracy.
Amen. Well put. Helen Dale, thank you very, very much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've listed some of the places that you write for, but if you want to give people the best in to read more of what you write, where should they be looking for you right now?
Well, for Americans especially, and I'm going to promote them here because they're an American organization, I am senior writer for Law and Liberty, which is a legally focused magazine published by Liberty Fund, which is one of your classic center-right think tanks. But unlike a lot of the others, Liberty Fund has what Steve Davies, the professor I was telling you about earlier, calls fuck off money. So they don't actually need donors, and they pay me very well. And I write a long feature for them every month. And they invited me to be senior writer, and it is where I am able to show to the greatest extent, compared to any other publication, even ones that I love dearly like The Australian and The Spectator, where I am able to show my thinking as a nuanced and very careful writer. I try to be careful and thoughtful and to make the world better informed at the end of every article that I write. And the best of my writing is, I think, at Law and Liberty.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you, Helen, and thank you to everybody at Podcast of the Lotus Eaters for making that happen. For making this happen. Cheers.
Cheers.
For more conversation on the dark and disordered psychology that shapes today's cultural and political left, subscribe to our weekly audio podcast on iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Google Podcasts, and virtually anywhere else you get your podcasts. Let's learn to recognize these dynamics and call them what they are. Subscribe to Disaffected to learn how to break the spell.